The classic English 4-4-2, with its trademark big man little man strike partnership, backed up by two solid banks of four, has for the last decade now been a dying art. Once so common in England that for any team to not play a 4-4-2 was seen as unusual, now the number of managers that actually utilise the formation is becoming incredibly scarce, with a new generation of managers ushering in new ideas, and even the most renowned of 4-4-2 managers, such as Carlo Ancelotti, are switching away from it. But how did this happen and why? How did a formation that as recently as 15 years ago was dominant in this country decline so heavily at the elite levels of the game? We'll get to that in a minute, but first, a quick history lesson. Okay, quick show of hands. Who can honestly say that they know the name of the man on screen right now? I'll give you 3 seconds. No? This is Victor Maslov, and despite having somewhat fallen out of the history books, he is the man who is credited with pioneering what we now know as the 4-4-2 formation. Here's how. In the late 50s and early 60s, while he was managing various teams in Russia and Ukraine in the former Soviet Union, most other teams played with a very attacking 4-2-4 formation inspired by the 1958 World Cup winning Brazil side containing Garrincha, Pele and co. This shape saw 2 centre forwards supplemented by 2 wide forwards, with a pair of central midfielders having to bridge the enormous gap between attack and defence all by themselves. To us now, we can immediately recognise that this formation would be completely overrun in midfield and very susceptible to counter-attacks, but this was the 1950s and tactics weren't nearly as refined as they are now. So in steps Maslov. His major innovation was simply to tweak the 4-2-4 by having his wide forwards sit deeper and become wide midfielders. A small change, but one that would fundamentally change the formation and was devastatingly effective against the disorganised, ultra-attacking tactics of the time. This was how the 4-4-2 came to be. Pause the video now to see in more depth what this tactical tweak allowed for Maslov's teams and why it was so effective against tactics of the time. So now with the roots of the 4-4-2 formation covered, let's take a look at the reasons why it has fallen out of fashion in the last 15 years.
The predominant formation used nowadays in European football is unquestionably the 4-3-3. In fact, if we look at all 15 teams that finished in the Champions League places in the major 5 leagues last season, we can see that most of the teams used a 4-3-3 or the quite similar 4-2-3-1. Only a small handful of teams used 4-4-2, mainly in France, while both Atletico and Juventus used a sort of hybrid 4-4-2/3-5-2 formation, where on paper it looks like a 4-4-2, but in reality it looks more like this, with one of the fullbacks functioning more as a wide midfielder, whilst the other tucks into a back three. So why has the 4-4-2 fallen so much out of favour amongst Europe's elite? Well, the 4-4-2 allows for 2 solid lines of 4 with the forwards supplied from out wide. 4-3-3, the dominant formation of the last decade, sacrifices one of the strikers for an additional defensive midfielder, which on the face of it is a defensive move, but the numerical advantage that this creates in the middle of the park allows for high levels of fluidity, often allowing the 4-3-3 to attack with greater numbers while still remaining solid at the back. In contrast, the 4-4-2 is a rigid formation, with all players having strict responsibilities and not a huge amount of personal freedom. To be clear, this is not an inherently bad thing, and it certainly has its uses in some situations, but generally, in this age where playing attractive football is what most clubs want to be doing, it's not ideal. The issue with playing 4-4-2 now is that there are only 2 central midfielders, and with the most popular formations last season being a 4-3-3 and a 4-2-3-1, they are almost always up against 3, and especially if the opposition is playing with a number 10, the 4-4-2 doesn't have a player to directly occupy them, and the number 10 can cause havoc. This means that in order to avoid being overrun, they are commonly forced to sit deep and protect the defence, but this means that they are also unable to cover out wide, meaning the wide midfielders have to protect their fullback, limiting their attacking output. The effect that this can potentially cause is having 8 outfield players pinned back to avoid being overrun, simply due to the numerical advantage in central midfield that the 4-3-3 has, and this causes the 2 strikers to become isolated. One of the strikers could then drop back into the hole in an attempt to link the play, leaving just one player in an attacking position who can very easily be snuffed out by the opposing defence. This very rarely happens with the 4-3-3, where the wide attackers often have little, if any, defensive responsibility, as the extra man in midfield allows them to shuffle across as a unit and cover the fullback as needed, eliminating the need for wide players to have to protect their fullback as much as is necessary in a 4-4-2. This means that there will always be 3 attackers available on the break, as opposed to just 1 in the 4-4-2 with the scenario from just a moment ago. Even if the other team is operating with very attacking fullbacks, all that is required is one of the central midfielders shift across and the opposite wide attacker drop to protect their fullback, still leaving 2 men up in attack. Having discussed how easily overrun 4-4-2 is in the defensive phase, now let's move on to the attacking phase. Generally, the two central midfielders will hold their position to protect against a counter-attack and also to provide an option for recycling the ball while the wide midfielders push on, meaning there are 4 attacking players. The fullbacks often have to be conservative because, as we've talked about, the wide attackers in a 4-3-3 have little defensive responsibility and therefore cannot be left unmarked. These 4 attacking midfielders can very easily be marked by the team playing a 4-3-3, either man-to-man or zonally, by their back 4 and defensive midfielder. This still leaves 2 more central midfielders spare to pick up any marauding central midfielders or fullbacks. So now that we've seen how easily the 4-4-2 can be outnumbered in its attacking phase, let's see if this is also true for the 4-3-3. Often when a good team plays 4-3-3, it becomes more of a 3-2-5 in attack. One of the fullbacks pushes up very high, while the winger on that same side tucks into the half space. The other fullback stays deeper to provide a recycling option and additional protection to the defence, and the winger on that side stays wide, whilst one of the central midfielders also pushes up into the other half space. And of course, the striker stays central, creating a 5-man attack. The key here is to have all the vertical spaces occupied, with attackers in wide areas, half spaces, and central areas, which becomes very difficult to mark. These 5 players will also commonly interchange with one another, and particularly the players in the half spaces can cause chaos, either requiring a midfielder to pick them up or dragging a defender out of position, which leaves a gap which can then be exploited. We can see here that almost all of the 4-4-2's outfield players are pinned back to mark these attackers, meaning that the 4-3-3 still has a numerical advantage at the back, protecting against a counter despite committing 5 man to the attack. All of these examples have shown how in most scenarios, the 4-4-2 is easily outmatched by the 4-3-3. In attack, the 4-4-2 can't commit as many men forward, and in defence they have to utilise almost all of their outfield players to prevent being overrun, leaving forwards isolated. This is of course very useful when playing to defend a lead, but outside of this specific example, 4-4-2 is at a definite disadvantage playing against a 4-3-3, which is able to easily mark the 4-4-2's limited manpower when defending and overload the 4-4-2 with marauding central midfielders and fullbacks on attack. With 4-3-3 now the dominant formation of the day, it is now easy to see why most managers are reluctant to play a 4-4-2.
Cheers for watching this video, and please drop a like and subscribe if you enjoyed. I'd really appreciate it. This was definitely the toughest video I've made so far in terms of production, but I really enjoyed the challenge. I've got loads more content on the way soon, so keep an eye out for that. Anyway, thanks again for watching, and bye for now.